Hello there. Today I'm taking a look at another New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. As I've said previously, evidently 72% of the Sauvignon Blanc, which has really formed the reputation of New Zealand as a wine producer over the years, actually comes from the Marlborough region at the top of the South Island, where there's something like about 19,000 hectares of Sauvignon Blanc planted. So here at Wine Searcher, we thought it might be quite fun to take a look at the other 28% of Sauvignon Blanc. And I mean, that's just the production figures. Probably more than 72% of what's exported will be from Marlborough. So it's possible these wines may not be easy to find outside the New Zealand market. So the wine I'm looking at today is Misha's vineyard, the Starlet. And this is a wine from Central Otago, particularly from the Bendigo region, and this is the 2023 vintage of that wine. So the vineyards that comprise the estate that is Misha's vineyard are situated in the hills overlooking Lake Dunstan. And these are poor soils, mostly comprising fractured rock, and there are areas of the vineyard where some of the soils comprise old gold mine workings from back in the 1860s and 70s, when Central Otago had its gold rush. The estate was established by Andy and Misha Wilkinson. Andy, a New Zealander, Misha actually originally from Australia, and they came to Central Otago having lived for quite a while in Asia, and they actually established the vineyards here pretty much from scratch, built the terraces, planted the vines in some really quite challenging conditions. It's quite windy here. They had to make some quite improvised use of shade cloth in order to form windbreaks when the vines were first establishing themselves. Since 2004, most of the vines planted here have been Pinot Noir, but they also make white wines not only from Sauvignon Blanc but from other aromatic varieties such as Gewürztraminer, Riesling, and they have some Pinot Gris as well. In all, this is a 57-hectare estate, and they describe their vineyards as being sun-drenched, north-facing terraces. Now, 2023 in Central Otago was a lot better here than it was in many regions further north in New Zealand, where there were some really quite serious weather events went on. In fact, it was warm and dry here. A fairly cloudy period during the spring actually delayed flowering, but thankfully conditions improved and the cycle was able to catch up. There was quite a good fruit set, and the relatively warm and dry season was ameliorated by some late rains that were sufficient to reinvigorate the vines and complete ripening, but didn't actually impose pressure in terms of fungal disease and the health of the fruit. And in fact, a record crop was harvested. This wine is a single vineyard wine, and they make the point that this is entirely estate grown fruit. The vineyard sits at somewhere between 240 and 280 metres above sea level, and it was planted in 2005 with what is described as a Massal selection, or MS clone. They don't make it clear where this was a Massal selection from, so presumably the clone was simply purchased as a Massal selection. Picking took place relatively late. It was on the 3rd and 4th of April. One thing that maybe indicates the flowering wasn't quite as regular as they would have liked is the fact that they made several passes through the vineyard while picking. Everything was picked by hand, and when it reached the winery, it was allowed to rest for an hour or so. So there was a short period of gentle skin contact prior to pressing. The fruit was whole bunch pressed, which should give some nice clean juice. It was allowed to settle, and then the wine was divided into two portions. 64% of it went into temperature-controlled stainless steel tanks, where it was inoculated with a cultured yeast, and a relatively long, cool, slow fermentation went on in order to preserve aromas. The remaining 36% of the juice was put into mostly old French oak barrels, where it was allowed to ferment with the indigenous yeasts that had come in on the fruit or were already in the winery. So the barrel fermentation would have gone on at a slightly warmer temperature, and the fact there were numbers of different barrels, all possibly fermenting at slightly different speeds and maybe with different yeast strains, would provide some complexity which would give the winemakers some blending options. Now, as well as these two portions, evidently 3% of the portion that had gone into tank was taken out of the tank while fermenting and run into a single new French oak barrel. It fermented in that barrel until it was dry and then was then put back into the tank. So again, adding an extra component, perhaps a little bit of oakiness, that will give some complexity to the final wine, probably a bit more richness as well. So let's have a look at the wine, shall we? The wine is relatively pale, a relatively pale yellow, perhaps there's a greenish touch, not particularly. The wine has 14% alcohol according to its label, and is quite easily forming some very obvious tears on the side of the glass there as I swirl it. So let's see what we make of the aroma, shall we? The initial aromas are quite a rich, sort of almost peach and pear note. There are perhaps apple notes, a little bit of lemoniness. Looking further beyond that, there's hints of passion fruit and perhaps a little bit of flintiness as well. There's a good richness, quite a concentration, and when you look for it, there's a reasonable complexity to the wine. So let's have a taste, shall we? There's a rich, round, textured fruit. The wine has a medium weight, and I think some of that is the skin contact that's going on. There's almost a juicy, high ripeness pear skin note there, and then there's a peachiness behind that. And actually, those notes of peach and pear are dominating the mid palate. I'm not particularly seeing the delicate notes of sort of grassiness and passion fruit that we saw on the aromas. There's a little bit of roundness coming from the yeast lees, although there's not a particularly obvious creamy flavour, such as the richness of the fruit. I think that's slightly overpowering that. And the 14% alcohol is giving a bit of warmth and a sort of an almost heading towards slightly honeyed, probably more sort of juicy peach note across the mid palate. And that rich, almost slightly toasty, I think that's probably the oak note coming through there on the back palate, is enduring quite well onto the finish, and then the finish sort of opens to show a bit more of that peachiness. This is a much richer wine than the wine from Waiheke we tried the other day. This would be much more a wine that would accompany foods, sort of river fish, cold white meats, that sort of thing, as opposed to the fresher, crisper, more lively, elegant, but much lighter bodied wine from Waiheke. A richer wine moving much more into the area that you might think of drinking Chardonnays in almost. Perhaps buoyed up by just that tiny note of oak. There's not a huge influence, but it is just showing there towards the back palate. Now, I looked at the aggregated critics score that we had for this wine, and I did, before tasting it, wonder if 95 might be a little bit generous for this wine. But actually, it has a richness, it has an elegance, and there's a lovely balance and a good length to the wine. So I don't think that's a completely unjustified score. It may be slightly generous, but that said, I think this probably has a life of 4 or 5 years if you wanted to age it. It has enough richness and concentration that it would do that. There's sufficient freshness. The acidity doesn't come to the front of the mouth, but it's sufficient to keep the fruit good and lively. I think you certainly see the cooling influence on the sun-drenched vineyards that's been exerted by the cooling effect of the altitude and the cooling winds that you get there. So there's a sort of a slight contrast between those two elements there. Yes, I am actually more impressed with this wine than I thought I would be. So thank you so much for joining us. I do hope you've enjoyed the tasting. If you have, it would be fantastic if you'd press the like button for us. If you'd like to watch more of these tastings, it would be superb if you could sign up and become a subscriber to our YouTube channel, and that way you can set yourself an alert and you can be notified every time we publish a new tasting. If you'd like to leave any comments, please pop those in the comments box below. We'd be really interested to hear what you think about this wine, about the tastings we're doing, or about anything else related to that at all. If you have any friends you think might like to watch the video, please do feel free to pass it on to them. We'd really appreciate that endorsement coming from you. But most importantly, we do hope you'll manage to make some time and come and join us for another tasting in the very near future. Thanks again. Bye for now.